My name is Miriam Blake, and the last words my daughter ever said to me before I left her house were, "You're just a burden now, Mom. I can't keep carrying dead weight." So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because trust me, when life flips the script, you might actually regret missing out on a story like this. I wasn't always someone to be dismissed like that. In my younger years, I ran one of the most respected inns on the coast of Maine. People came from all over to feel the warmth of the old Blake House Inn, the smell of cinnamon from my apple crumble, the handmade quilts, the candlelight glow. Back then I mattered. People thanked me, respected me, needed me, but time, like ocean tides, slowly eroded the edges of my identity. My husband passed. The inn was sold off after a bad tax season. And my health, a stroke of arthritis, and a few dizzy spells, was the final excuse for everyone to decide I needed taking care of. My daughter Emily offered me the guest room. It was actually a converted laundry space, barely big enough for the twin bed they shoved into the corner. But I said yes, because I thought, maybe being around family will be good. Maybe Emily's children, my grandchildren, will bring me back to life. The first week felt like a trial. I tiptoed around asking if I could make breakfast or fold laundry. I was trying to contribute, trying to matter. But Emily brushed me off with, "We've got our routine, Mom. Just rest." Rest. It was a strange word. Because rest without purpose feels a lot like being erased. By the second week, I'd become invisible. They ate dinner without calling me. My laundry piled up in the hallway, sometimes folded by the teenage maid they hired. Yes, they could afford a maid, but not space or respect for me. The worst was the way Emily's husband Brad looked at me. Polite but cold, like I was a responsibility he'd rather not have. He called me ma'am. Not Mom, not Miriam, just ma'am. Like I was a stranger on a customer service line. One evening, I was heating leftover soup alone in the kitchen. Brad came in, opened the fridge, and mumbled, "You left the stove on last night. Nearly scorched the kettle." I looked up, startled. I thought I turned it off. He closed the fridge hard and said nothing. But his eyes said everything. "You shouldn't be here." That night, I cried in the tiny room with the humming laundry machine beside my bed. I thought about the Blake House Inn, about how I used to write thank you notes to guests by hand, about how every corner had my touch. And now, I was a ghost in someone else's home. One afternoon, I offered to pick up my granddaughter Kayla from her ballet class. Emily reluctantly said yes. "Just don't get confused at the intersection again, okay?" I arrived on time. I even brought a snack in a paper bag like I used to make for Emily when she was little, apple slices and cheddar cheese. Kayla got into the car, looked at the snack, then looked at me and laughed. "You're so weird, Grandma. No one eats that. Don't you know anything?" She posted something on Snapchat while I drove. I only caught a glimpse, but it said, "Carpooling with the Crypt Keeper." My chest tightened. I said nothing. That evening, I made a small comment, just a passing thing, about how I used to help Emily with her homework, even when I had night shifts. Emily sighed. "Mom, can you not make everything about the past? You chose to work instead of being there. That's not my fault." That was the first knife. It twisted something inside me I didn't know was still raw. But the final blow came a few days later. It was late. I was heading to the kitchen for water when I heard them talking. Brad and Emily. Voices hushed but sharp. "She's just a burden now. She's not contributing. And the kids don't even like her." I know. But she's my mom, Brad. Then maybe you take a break from being a mom. Because right now she's just dead weight. I stood frozen in the hallway, back pressed against the wall. Tears welling but not falling. My ears rang, but every word was etched like stone. A burden. Dead weight. Unwanted. The next morning, I folded the bedsheets, neatly wiped the mirror in my corner space, and opened my old planner. There, in a faded pocket, was a business card from an old friend, Judith Keene. She ran the local library. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, but suddenly I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to fight for their approval. I wasn't going to beg for kindness. No more waiting. If they thought I was dead weight, then maybe it was time I disappeared. And reappeared as something they'd never expect. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay still in the dark, listening to the hum of the laundry machine and the occasional creak of pipes in the walls. But inside me something had shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even grief anymore. It was clarity. When someone tells you you're a burden, what they really mean is, you no longer serve a purpose for me. I'd given purpose to others my entire life. I was done handing it out like slices of pie, hoping someone would offer me a seat at the table. It was time to claim my own plate. The next morning, I waited until the house was quiet. Emily had taken the kids to school. Brad was at work. I made a single phone call from the kitchen landline. Judith Keene speaking came a familiar, crisp voice on the other end. "Judy," I said, my voice trembling a little. "It's Miriam." A pause. Then a warm laugh. "Miriam Blake. I thought you were in Florida or somewhere retired and fabulous." "Not quite," I said. "Do you still run the library board?" "Still chairing it. And we miss you, by the way." I took a breath. "Do you need volunteers?" She didn't even hesitate. "Are you kidding? I'd hire you to run the place if I could. Come by tomorrow. We'll have coffee and gossip." That was all I needed. That night, I packed a small overnight bag and tucked it under the bed. Just the essentials. A few clothes, my planner, a photo of my husband, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and a small envelope of cash I'd saved over the years. Birthday gifts, pension leftovers, a few tucked-away tips from the old inn days. Emily noticed something the next morning. She asked casually while pouring her smoothie, "Did you do the laundry yesterday?" I couldn't find the navy sheets. I smiled gently. I folded them and put them in the hall closet. She didn't say thank you, just nodded and walked away already on her phone. That afternoon, I stood at the edge of the kitchen while she scrolled through emails. I asked, "Would you mind if I went to visit a friend tomorrow morning?" "Just for a little while." She didn't look up. "Sure. Just don't forget Kayla has violin practice." I nodded. I wouldn't be here by the time that violin was even tuned. The next morning, I dressed with quiet purpose. Dark slacks, a soft gray sweater, a simple scarf around my neck. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who was no longer begging to belong. I left a note on the small nightstand in my room. Not bitter, not accusatory. Just 3 lines. "Thank you for your hospitality. I've gone to find my space in the world again. Please don't worry. I'm fine." I closed the front door behind me with care, not drama. The cab arrived 2 minutes later. Judith's smile when she saw me felt like spring sunlight. "You look like a woman on a mission," she said, handing me a cup of tea. I said, "and I'm tired of asking permission." We sat in the staff room of the library, a cozy space with overstuffed chairs and the smell of ink and paper. She told me there was a position open, volunteer, of course, but they needed someone to organize the community reading events. "You'd be perfect," she said. "I'd be honored." And just like that, I began to rebuild. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed in a small room above a used bookstore. Judith had a friend who owned the shop and offered me a room in exchange for helping with inventory. The room had a crooked window, a lumpy bed, and books stacked to the ceiling. But for the first time in years, it felt like my own. I walked to the library every morning, organized author signings, designed flyers for Children's Reading Hour, even hosted a poetry afternoon for retirees. People smiled when they saw me. They asked for advice. They thanked me. And I started to remember, this is who I was. This is who I am. One afternoon, as I was restocking a shelf, a little girl tapped my arm. "Are you the book lady who reads the funny voices?" she asked. I smiled. "Guilty." She grinned. "You sound like my grandma used to, before she got old." I knelt beside her and said, "Well, maybe getting old just means we have better stories to tell." She nodded solemnly. "Like wizards." "Exactly like wizards." We both laughed. That laugh stayed with me all evening. Meanwhile, back at Emily's house, the texts started rolling in. First, "Mom, where are you?" Then, "Are you okay?" And eventually, "Why would you leave like this? You scared the kids." "Brad's furious." I didn't reply. Not because I was cruel, but because for once their emotions weren't my responsibility. I had spent too many years cleaning up other people's feelings, smoothing over their rough edges while mine bled underneath. It was time to let them feel it. Judith invited me to join the library board full-time. It didn't pay much, barely a stipend, but she said, "We could list you as director of outreach." The title wasn't the point. The respect was, and when I saw the flyer with my name on it for our upcoming Community Women's Voices event, something clicked inside me. My voice had never been missing. It had simply been unheard. Until now. I never thought I'd speak in front of a crowd again. At the inn, I was always in the background serving tea, smoothing linens, making sure the guests felt heard. I wasn't the woman who took center stage. I was the one who made the stage look beautiful. But Judith insisted. "This event is about women reclaiming their stories," she said, as she handed me the final schedule. Who better to speak than someone who lived quietly for decades and still stood back up? I looked at the list of other names: authors, business owners, former educators. And then mine. Keynote speaker, Miriam Blake. I didn't feel fear. I felt ready. The event took place at the Civic Center in town. Rows of folding chairs were filled with women of all ages. Some came with walkers, some with strollers. All came with stories folded into their hearts like pressed flowers. I stood behind the microphone with trembling hands, but my voice did not shake. "My name is Miriam Blake. I am 72 years old. For most of my life, I was invisible in all the ways people don't talk about. Not because I lacked value, but because the world is very good at convincing women that if we're not useful to others, we're not useful at all. I raised a daughter. I ran a business. I made homes feel like home for people who weren't even my family. And yet one day someone I loved told me I was just a burden. I believed her. For about a minute. Then I remembered. I'm not a burden. I'm a library of wisdom. I'm a lighthouse. And even if no one notices the light at first, I will keep shining." I didn't look up until I finished. What I saw when I did? Dozens of women wiping tears from their cheeks. And at the back of the room, Judith, arms crossed, smiling like a proud sister. A local college student recorded my speech on her phone and uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "She said this and it wrecked me. I'm not a burden. I'm a library." So, I didn't know it had gone viral until 3 days later when Judith called me and yelled through the phone, "Miriam, you're at 600,000 views. People are making stitched videos with your voice." "What does stitched mean?" I asked, confused. She laughed. "It means you're trending, darling." Within a week, I'd received emails from women in Oregon, Canada, and even Germany. One read, "I watched your speech while folding laundry in the basement I live in. You reminded me. I'm not finished. Thank you." Another said, "You gave words to the shame I've been swallowing for years." I cried reading them, not because I was sad, but because I was finally seen. Not for what I'd done for others, but for who I was. Then came the call from the Blake House Inn. The new owner, a young woman named Serena, had seen the video and reached out through Judith. "We still use your recipe for the apple crumble," she said when we spoke over the phone. "Guests ask about you all the time." I laughed. "Do they ask about the woman who hand-stitched all the drapes?" "Yes. And they want to know why there's no story about her in the guest book." That afternoon, Serena invited me back not just to visit, to consult, to help bring back the soul of the inn, to return not as the ghost in the walls, but as its living spirit. I said yes. Of course I said yes. When I told Judith, she hugged me so tightly I could feel her heartbeat. "You're going to be legendary," she whispered. "Not legendary," I said. "Just restored." I moved into the guest cottage behind the inn, a simple, quiet space with a fireplace, a view of the sea, and windows that caught the sunrise just right. Every morning, I walked into the Blake house through the front door, the same door I used to hold open for strangers. Only this time, the staff greeted me like I was the story. 2 weeks into my return, we hosted a women's heritage brunch at the inn. I wore a navy blue dress and a string of pearls. Nothing fancy, just classic. After dessert, I shared a shortened version of my speech from the Civic Center. When I stepped off the stage, a woman came up to me, tears in her eyes. "I saw your video," she said. "I sent it to my daughter. I think it saved us." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "You saved yourselves. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." Later that evening, I lit a candle in my cottage, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window with my planner. I flipped to the note I'd written weeks ago before leaving Emily's house. Thank you for your hospitality. I've gone to find my space in the world again. Please don't worry. I'm fine. I folded it and placed it in the fireplace. I didn't need it anymore. I had found my space. I was more than fine. I didn't expect the headlines. A few weeks after the brunch, a local newspaper published a piece titled, "The Woman Who Vanished and Came Back as a Voice for Us All." They included a photo of me standing in front of the Blake House Inn, sunlight catching the curve of my silver hair, my eyes half closed from the brightness. I smiled when I saw it, not because of the article, but because of the caption underneath. Not a burden. A lighthouse. That phrase followed me like a shadow of grace. More interviews came. The library's event organizer asked me to speak again this time as the keynote for the Women Who Rise series. A community college offered me a spot on a discussion panel. Serena created a section in the inn's guestbook titled Stories from Miriam, and guests left paragraphs of what the place meant to them. I wasn't just living, I was blooming. But one thing kept looming like a fog just beyond the shore. Emily. I hadn't heard from her since my silent exit. No calls. No voicemails. Only one final text weeks ago. I hope you're happy now. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't owe her a response to a statement that tried to blame me for walking away from blame itself. And yet the ache lingered, because for all the growth and restoration, she was still my daughter. Then, one rainy morning, Judith burst into the inn's office waving her phone. "Look at this," she said, breathless. It was a Facebook post. From Emily. A long one. Public. I stared at it. I didn't know what I had until it was gone. My mother was never a burden. She was the steady ground under my feet. I just didn't know how to stand on my own, so I tried to shrink her down to fit my fear. But she found her voice, and now the whole world hears it. I only hope one day she'll let me listen again. The tears came fast. I set the phone down gently and walked outside into the rain. Sometimes the world doesn't need to say sorry with flowers. Sometimes a confession to strangers is the first apology a heart can give. 2 days later she appeared. Emily. At the front desk of the inn, hair damp from the drizzle, eyes read a paper bag clutched in her hand. "Serena came to find me. There's a woman asking for you. Says she's your daughter." I walked out slowly. There she was, my grown child, who had once told me I didn't belong standing under the chandeliers I used to polish until they gleamed. "Mama," she whispered. No one had called me that in years. We stared at each other. She held out the paper bag. Her hands were shaking. "I brought you apple slices and cheddar," she said, "like you used to make me." It was so specific, so tender, so unexpected. My throat tightened. I reached out, took the bag, and nodded. "Thank you." That was all. Because sometimes I'm sorry doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real. We sat in the parlor room. She spoke first. I was overwhelmed. Trying to be everything. A mom, a wife, a career woman. And when you came, I saw all the ways I wasn't enough. I didn't know how to ask for help without feeling like I'd failed. I sipped my tea. "You didn't fail, Emily. You just didn't see that I wasn't asking to lead. I was asking to walk beside you." She cried then. The kind of cry that curls your body inward. "I missed you. The kids. They miss you. Kayla keeps asking if you'll ever come back." I let the silence sit before I replied. "No, I won't come back. But you can come to me." She looked confused. "I'm not returning to a place where I was small, but I will always open the door to people who see me whole." That afternoon we walked the garden paths together behind the inn. She looked at the roses blooming near the stone wall and said softly, "You grew all this." "No," I said. "But I tended to it." That's the part people always forget. Growth needs hands. She took my hand then. "Maybe I can help you tend to it now." I nodded. "We'll see." That night alone in my cottage, I wrote in my journal, "Healing doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it just means restoration. The difference is choice." And I had chosen to be whole again on my terms. Emily could be part of that, but she would never again define it. Days passed. Then weeks. Emily began to visit the inn regularly, never without calling ahead, never uninvited. She brought the children too cautiously at first, as if unsure whether they still fit in my world. But Kayla surprised me. She walked into the lobby one Saturday morning wearing a yellow hoodie and holding a book in her hands. "I watched your speech," she said, eyes not quite meeting mine. "The one about being invisible." I nodded slowly. She fidgeted, then held out the book. "The Secret Garden. Can you read this with me?" It was the same book I had read to Emily when she was Kayla's age. I took it from her hands. Of course. We started reading every Saturday. At first, just the two of us. Then her little brother joined. Then, surprisingly, Emily asked if she could sit in too. We sat in the parlor room of the Blake house around the fireplace. The same room that once hosted bridal parties, book clubs, and vacationing couples. Now it held something more sacred: restoration. Kayla listened closely to the story of Mary Lennox, an unloved child who discovered life again through a forgotten garden. And perhaps without knowing, she was also listening to the echoes of her own family. Emily began opening up in small ways. "I've started therapy," she told me one day while we were pruning the hydrangeas outside. "To figure out why I treated you the way I did. Why I never dealt with Dad's death." I looked up. "That's brave." She smiled faintly. "You were brave first." There was no pride in my chest. Only peace. But peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of something stronger than pain. And mine was this: I no longer feared being alone, because alone did not mean unloved. It meant free. One evening, as the summer twilight painted the cottage gold, I sat by the fireplace and reread the notes from my guestbook section. One entry read, "My mom and I stayed here after a fight that nearly broke us. Your story helped us speak again. Thank you." Another said, "I sent your video to my boss after she pushed my retirement early. She cried and called me back. I'm now leading a mentorship program." I placed the book gently on my lap and exhaled. This was more than revenge. This was redemption. The next morning, Serena came to me with an idea. "We want to start a program here," she said, excitement in her voice. "A retreat for women over 60 who feel forgotten. We'll call it the Lighthouse Series. And I want you to lead it." I blinked. "Me?" "Yes, you. You're already doing it, Miriam. You're living proof." My hands shook slightly. I wasn't used to being given this kind of power, not in name only, but in trust. I said yes. And so it began. Women arrived from across the country. Some carried grief. Some carried silence. All carried stories that had never been listened to. We gathered in circles. We cooked together. We told truths we'd never said aloud. And on the final night of each retreat, we held a candlelight walk to the cliff's edge behind the Blake House Inn. Each woman holding her own light, each flame a life refused to be extinguished. During the third retreat, a woman named Rosa took my hand. "I was going to end it all last year," she whispered. "Then someone sent me your video. I stayed. I came. And now, I think I have a reason again." I held her tightly, letting the ocean wind whip around us. There were no words necessary, just the shared knowledge. We were never burdens. We were the roots that held broken trees, the beams that supported roofs through winter storms, the stories that kept whole families from forgetting who they were. One evening, Kayla asked Grandma, "Are you famous now?" I smiled. "No, sweetheart. I'm just finally heard." She tilted her head. "But you should be. You're the coolest person I know." I laughed. "Then maybe that's enough." Later, I sat by the window of the cottage, watching the sea shift shades beneath the moon. I thought of the hallway where I once stood listening to Emily call me dead weight. I thought of how that pain didn't kill me. It woke me. And I knew something for certain. Life doesn't end when someone shuts a door on you. Sometimes that's just how you find your own key. Fall arrived like a soft hush. The garden at the Blake house took on deeper colors: rust red, golden yellow, the dusky purple of fading hydrangeas. Guests came and went with scarves around their necks and stories in their eyes. The wind grew cooler, and so did my heart in the best way. A coolness that comes from settling, not retreating. One afternoon, I found myself sitting with Emily on the inn's back porch. We were drinking cider, watching Kayla run through the leaf piles with a shriek of pure joy. "She's lighter now," Emily said, her voice quiet. "Happier. She feels safe," I replied. Emily turned to me. "Were you ever afraid I wouldn't come back around?" I took a sip. Let the words come slow and sure. "No, I was only afraid I'd wait too long for someone who wasn't ready. She didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded. That's fair. We let the silence sit between us like an old friend. A week later, I received an invitation in the mail. Women of Courage. Honoring community voices. I was listed as a recipient. Judith laughed when she saw it. You've gone and become a local legend, you know. I shook my head, smiling. I didn't plan on any of this. You didn't have to, she said. You just showed up fully, and that's more than most people ever do. At the ceremony, I wore a soft gray dress and the old pearl earrings my husband had given me for our 25th anniversary. The auditorium was packed. When they called my name, I walked slowly to the podium and looked out at the faces, young, old, black, white, weary, proud. I paused, let the silence gather. A few years ago, I thought my life was shrinking. I had been told I was a burden, that I was no longer useful, that the world had moved past me. But I stand here today to say this. You don't have to prove your worth to people who've forgotten how to recognize it. You don't have to stay in places where your light is dimmed. You are allowed, no invited, to start again. I did, and I didn't do it by becoming someone new. I did it by remembering who I had always been. The applause was quiet at first. Then it swelled. It wasn't explosive. It was deep. Like something real had settled in every chest. Backstage, a young woman approached me. Probably early 30s. She looked nervous, holding a notepad. I've been trying to write something like what you said, she stammered. But I didn't have the words. You do, I told her. They're just buried under what others told you was allowed. She blinked, and smiled, and nodded. Another candle lit. That night, I sat on the porch of the cottage, blanket wrapped around my shoulders, tea steaming in my hands. Emily joined me. I watched a recording of your speech, she said. Oh, you said you didn't become someone new. Just remembered who you always were. She turned to look at me. Can I ask something? Who were you, Mama, before I knew you? It was the first time in a long time she'd used that word. Mama. I let the question settle before answering. I was a girl who liked thunder because it made the world stop and listen. I was a young woman who poured her love into teacups and linens. I was a wife who wrote poetry on receipts. And I was a mother who gave everything, sometimes too quietly. But now, I'm a woman who finally speaks in her own volume. Emily nodded, tears quietly tracing her jawline. She whispered, I'm proud of you. That night, I opened a new journal. Page 1. I wrote, this chapter begins with no apologies, only fireflies, and the sound of someone finally walking through her own door. A few days later, the first retreat under the Lighthouse series officially launched. 20 women arrived. Each had their own wound, some fresh, some older than memory. We gathered in a circle beneath the old oak tree behind the inn, the late autumn sun slanting through the branches. I began, my name is Miriam Blake. I'm 72 years old, and I once disappeared from a house that forgot me, so I could return to the world that remembered. Gasps. Nods. A few held hands. One woman closed her eyes like she'd just heard scripture. I looked around. This weekend, we're not fixing each other. We're recognizing ourselves. And with that, the healing began again. The innkeeper, the burden, the ghost in the hallway, the lighthouse. All of them were me. None of them defined me. I define me. Winter crept in quietly. The first frost came overnight, dressing the garden in a shimmer of white. The sea beyond the inn grew steel gray, and the wind turned sharp with salt. But inside the Blake house, warmth grew like firelight behind every window. The Lighthouse series continued through the season, smaller groups now, with women wrapped in scarves and thick cardigans, their stories steaming up the parlor room windows. Each retreat brought someone new, a former teacher who'd been pushed out of her school because she wasn't relatable anymore. A woman whose children had moved her to an assisted living facility and never visited. A widow who hadn't spoken aloud to another human in over 6 months. They all arrived brittle. They all left burning. One retreat evening, as snow began falling outside the window, we sat in a circle around the fireplace. I asked them to write one word they'd been called that still haunted them. The papers passed around. Burden. Too much. Unlovable. Selfish. Forgotten. Dead weight. I read each one aloud. Then I dropped them one by one into the fire. These aren't names, I said. They're projections of other people's limits. And they don't belong to you anymore. There was silence. And then a woman named Lydia whispered, I've been carrying that word for 12 years. Then tonight I said you set it down. She cried. We all did. In the weeks that followed, I began receiving letters addressed not to the inn, but to me personally. Some came from women who had never met me but had watched the speech. Others were from daughters, sisters, nieces writing on behalf of women who couldn't find their own voice yet. One stood out. My mother watched your story in her hospice bed. She said, Tell that woman she made me feel real again before I go. So I'm writing to say thank you. You were the last person who saw her. I held the letter to my chest for a long time. The ink was smudged in places and I knew why. Sometimes you don't realize the ripples you send out until someone tells you they reached the other shore. Emily asked to co-host a retreat with me. At first I hesitated, but something in her tone had shifted, not the eager child asking for approval, but the grown woman wanting to help carry something with care. So I said yes, and we did it together. She handled the logistics, food, accommodations, coordination. I handled the hearts. At the end of the weekend, a woman approached us. You two are, well, you're the beginning and the return. We looked at each other, unsure what to say, but somehow that phrase felt right. On Christmas Eve, I stayed in the cottage while the rest of the inn bustled with families and guests sipping cocoa by the fire. The scent of cinnamon and pine needles wrapped around everything. There was a soft knock at my door. Emily stood there holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. Merry Christmas, Mama, she said. Inside the box was a tiny glass figurine of a lighthouse. I held it in my palm like it was made of memory. It's not from a store, she said quickly. Kayla and I made it at a local studio. I love it, I said. She hesitated. Can I ask something? Of course. Do you forgive me? I looked into her eyes, so much like my own, only younger, still learning. I forgave you the moment I realized I didn't need your permission to live fully, I said. But forgiveness is a beginning, not an erasure. She nodded. Then maybe we can begin again. We already have. That night, I placed the lighthouse on my windowsill. Outside, the snow fell in slow, silent flakes. Inside, my heart felt full, not with nostalgia, but with presence. This life, this chapter wasn't what I had planned. It was better, because I had written it myself. A week later, I received a call from a national women's organization. They wanted to feature the Lighthouse series as a national model. They wanted to fly me to D.C., put me on stage. I thought of how I'd stood once in a hallway barely breathing as my daughter called me a burden. And I thought of standing now on a stage before hundreds called a light. I smiled at the irony, at the justice, at the poetry of it all, and I said yes. I'll be there. I once believed the cruelest thing someone could do was call you useless. But I was wrong. The cruelest thing is when we start to believe it. I don't believe it anymore. And now I make sure others don't either. I'm Miriam Blake. I am not a burden. I am not dead weight. I am not invisible. I am a lighthouse. And the light is always on. I'd never been on a plane alone. The last time I flew anywhere was 30 years ago to attend a funeral in Ohio, my cousin Helen. Back then, I had been nervous because I didn't know how to grieve around strangers. This time, I was nervous for an entirely different reason. I was flying to Washington, D.C., not as someone's guest, not as someone's +1, but as someone invited. I clutched the itinerary they'd mailed me like a lifeline. National Women's Resilience Conference. Keynote speaker, Miriam Blake, founder, The Lighthouse series. I stared at the words as if they were written in another language. Who would have thought a woman who once hid in the laundry room of her daughter's house would be stepping onto a national stage? The night before the flight, I stayed up late packing. Judith had insisted I wear the navy silk suit she'd gifted me after my first Civic Center speech. You look like a queen in it, she said. Let them bow if they must. I laughed but folded it carefully into the suitcase all the same. I added my pearls, my husband's old watch, and one small photograph. Me standing in front of the Blake house, wind lifting my scarf, smiling not for anyone else, but because I had finally come home to myself. The flight was smooth, the hotel elegant, the city overwhelming in its scale and symbols. On the morning of the conference, I stood backstage in a marble-floored auditorium that could fit 5 of the Blake houses side by side. I could hear the hum of the crowd, mostly women, journalists, advocates, organizers, survivors. A woman with a headset approached. "You're on in 5. I nodded. My heart beat steady like a quiet drum. I closed my eyes and whispered not a prayer, but a promise. "You've survived invisibility. Now step forward like someone meant to be seen." They introduced me with a list of titles: speaker, founder, advocate, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence that fell when I stepped up to the podium. Thousands of eyes, no sound. Just listening. I took a breath. My name is Miriam Blake. I wasn't born powerful. I was born kind, and the world mistook my kindness for silence. For decades, I believed that if I just stayed useful, I'd stay loved. But one day, someone I once carried through fevers and heartbreak told me I was just a burden. And in that moment, something shattered. But I want to tell you, sometimes shattering is the beginning of shining. I spoke for nearly 20 minutes, not from notes, from memory, from pain, from healing. And when I finished, the room stood, not for applause, but for recognition. Not for me alone, but for every woman who had ever been pushed to the margins and dared to stand again. That night, I returned to my hotel room and opened my laptop. There were hundreds of messages. One read, "I watched your speech with my 78-year-old mother. She said, 'Finally, someone told my story.' Thank you." Another, "I was planning to leave this world. Then I saw you say, 'Shattering is the beginning of shining.' I'm staying now. I booked a therapy session. I want to live." I leaned back in the chair, tears hot on my cheeks. It's strange how we carry our own pain like it's useless baggage until we place it down in the center of the room and someone else says, "Me too." The next day, the organization invited me to join their board as a senior advisor. "We need your voice," they said. "Women trust you." I thought about it for a long moment. I wasn't looking for prestige, but I was looking to make my voice count on a wider scale. So I said yes. And just like that, a woman once discarded now had a seat at the table where decisions were made. Back at the Blake house, Serena greeted me with flowers. "People have been calling nonstop," she said. "The next 3 lighthouse retreats are already booked. And we've had requests from women in 8 different states asking how they can start one in their towns." I was stunned. And then, without planning it, I laughed. A full, deep, living laugh. Because somehow in all this rise, I had almost forgotten the simplest joy of all. I was no longer surviving. I was building. Emily came that weekend with Kayla. They brought muffins. We sat in the kitchen together the way we never used to. Kayla said, "Grandma, are you famous now?" I shook my head. "No, I'm just finally not afraid to speak." Emily leaned in. "Well, you've helped a lot of people feel the same." I looked at her, not as the daughter who once failed me, but as the woman who was learning, unlearning, and loving again. That night, I stood outside the inn and looked up at the dark sea sky. The lighthouse on the edge of the bay blinked in the distance, steady, soft, unwavering. I whispered into the wind. I was once called a burden. Now I light paths. Not in spite of that label, but because I refused to wear it. And the wind carried it away, not as a lament, but as a testament. Winter gave way to spring, and with it, the Blake House Inn blossomed once more. Tulips lined the stone paths, and the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen floated through open windows. The inn, once just a building I maintained with fading pride, had become something sacred, a place of becoming for others and for myself. I began to keep a second journal separate from the personal one by my bed. I titled it, "The Archive of the Unheard." Every retreat guest was invited to write one truth inside it. Just one. Some wrote in elegant script. Others scrawled in crooked lines. But every page held a reclaiming, "I mattered even when he said I didn't." I was the backbone, not the burden. This time I walked out before they forgot my name. I forgive myself for staying so long. The journal grew fat with ink and sorrow and power. And I began to understand. This was no longer just my story. It was ours. One afternoon, Serena knocked on my cottage door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, eyes twinkling. I opened the front door to find a woman standing beside a taxi holding a suitcase. Gray hair, cautious eyes, neatly dressed like someone taught to be invisible. Her name was Clara, 65. She had left a marriage of 40 years the week before. He said I was too old to start over, she told me. So I left while he was at the dentist. I laughed. That might be the best exit line I've ever heard. Clara became one of our strongest alumni after her retreat. She went on to open a community cafe staffed by retired women. Its name, still rising. We began collecting names, not of those who hurt us, but of those who survived being hurt and refused to disappear. Each name added to a wall in the garden etched on copper leaves that hung from a sculpture Judith commissioned in secret. She unveiled it one Sunday afternoon. It was a tall frame of intertwined branches shaped like an open book. Dozens of copper leaves caught the sunlight. At the base, an inscription: "For every woman called a burden, you carried the world, and then rebuilt your own." I couldn't speak when I saw it. I just placed my hand on the bark-like frame and let the wind do the talking. Months passed. The Lighthouse series expanded to 12 cities. A publisher approached me to write a book. A journalist from The Atlantic requested an interview, but amidst all that noise, the most meaningful voice still came from Kayla. She had grown taller. Her braces recently removed her laughter fuller. One evening, we sat together at the cottage table playing Scrabble. She paused mid-turn and asked, "Grandma, do you miss living with us?" I set down a tile. "Sometimes. But I don't miss who I was back then." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I was small," I said. "Not in body, but in spirit. I had made myself small to fit a space that didn't honor me." She was quiet for a while, then placed her own tiles. "GROW. Is that what you did?" "Yes, sweetheart. I grew beyond the pot I was planted in." A week later, Emily came to one of the retreats, not as a co-host this time, but as a participant. At first I worried. Would people recognize her as my daughter? Would she feel shame? But something miraculous happened. On the second day during our sharing circle, she stood and said, "I was the one who forgot my mother. And when she left, I finally remembered myself." This retreat didn't just heal her, it gave her the space to save herself. And in doing that, she lit the path for me. No one spoke for a full minute. Then Clara, the woman who left during the dentist appointment, stood and clapped. And we all followed. That night, I found Emily outside watching the stars. "I'm proud of you," I said. She turned to me smiling. "That means more than you know." I placed my arm around her shoulder. "We're not perfect," I whispered, "but we're possible." Later, I wrote one more entry in my personal journal. "You are allowed to rewrite your ending, even if the world decided what your story was supposed to be." Especially then, I used to think that silence was something forced upon you. But now I know silence, when chosen, can be the most powerful sound in the world. I didn't scream when they dismissed me. I didn't fight when they forgot me. I simply stepped out and returned as someone unforgettable. The spring rolled gently into summer, and the inn took on a different rhythm, lighter yet fuller. Families came in droves. Old couples booked weekends just to be near the garden. Solo travelers sat in the parlor room quietly reading books from our lending shelf, pausing every now and then to stare at the fireplace as if it whispered to them. The Blake house was no longer just a place to stay. It was becoming something else entirely, a sanctuary. Serena renamed the main wing's hallway the Hall of Echoes. Framed quotes from retreat participants lined the walls, handwritten, honest, and unsanitized. I was 70 when I heard someone call me beautiful without it being a joke. Leaving him was hard. Believing I deserved to, that was harder. I used to think I was weak because I didn't fight back. Now I know silence was my strongest sword. People began taking photos with the wall, like it was a monument. It was, in a way, not a monument to suffering, but to survival. One morning, I found a package waiting at the front desk. There was no return address. Inside was a hand-bound journal and a note in small, elegant handwriting. "I'm not ready to come to your retreat, but I heard your voice in my own head last night. It told me to start writing again. So I did. Thank you for leaving the house that tried to bury you. Because now I'm starting to dig myself out." I sat down with that journal in my lap, breath caught somewhere between sorrow and hope. Later that week, Judith came to the cottage for tea. She'd been slower lately, her knees stiff, her hands always in gloves, but her mind was as sharp as ever. I had a dream about you, she said. You were standing on a pier and women were boarding boats behind you. All different ages, some crying, some laughing. And you just stood there handing them lanterns. I smiled. Sounds poetic. She leaned in. It wasn't a metaphor. It was prophecy. I laughed so hard I spilled my tea. But something about her words stayed with me for days. Kayla helped me with the garden that Saturday. She'd grown into her voice too. Not loud, but confident. Less screen-bound. More rooted. She asked me, "What would you do if the inn ever got too full?" I teased, "Start a second one, maybe next to a lighthouse." She nodded serious. "I think that would be cool. A second house. For women who can't speak yet but want to learn." I looked at her. She wasn't just imagining a building. She was imagining continuity. And suddenly I realized this wasn't just a movement. It was a legacy. That night I wrote a letter. Not to Emily. Not to a retreat guest. But to my younger self. Dear Miriam, you are going to be told more than once that you're too much, too quiet, too dependent, too fragile. You will carry these words for years like rusted keys trying to open doors that were never meant for you. One day someone will call you a burden, and it will hurt, and it will also set you free, because what they'll never expect is what happens next. You rise, you write, you reclaim every version of yourself that was ever asked to shrink. Keep going. The world will catch up to your worth eventually. I signed it simply. Me. At the next retreat, I read the letter aloud. The women cried, of course. So did I. But not because of pain. Because it felt like I was finally welcoming every lost part of myself home. Clara came up to me afterward, placing her hands on my shoulders. "You didn't just build a lighthouse," she said. "You became one." A journalist from NPR called the Blake House one of the most quietly radical feminist spaces in America. I chuckled at that headline, because we weren't burning bras or marching in parades. We were passing teacups, relearning how to hold eye contact, finding the courage to say, "That hurt me. I'm still here. You can't take my story from me." One woman wrote on the wall in the Hall of Echoes, "We didn't come here to rage. We came here to remember." That to me was the quiet revolution. Not rebellion, but reclamation. A few weeks later, Serena and I walked the grounds together. She turned to me and said, "What do you want to do next?" I looked toward the sea. The horizon was clear, the sun low. "I want to keep telling the truth," I said, "until no one ever has to question their worth again." She nodded. "Then we'll keep the light on." And I knew she meant it not just for me, but for every woman still trying to find her way home. I never thought of myself as an author, but the publisher from New York was persistent. Her name was Colette, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked curls and the kind of posture that said, "I've had to prove myself in too many rooms." We spoke over the phone at first, then on video calls. "I don't want a book of speeches," she said. "I want your life. The whole truth, even the parts you wanted to bury." I hesitated. "That's not easy," she smiled. "That's why it's necessary." So I began. Every morning before the inn woke up, I sat at the kitchen table in my cottage, a mug of lemon water beside me, the laptop humming and the cursor blinking like a pulse. I typed slowly at first, just fragments. The hallway, the forgotten birthdays, the way silence made me disappear, the sound of her voice saying burden. But then the stories began to flow, not just about Emily, about my childhood. About the time I gave up a scholarship to care for my sick father. About the night I lost my wedding ring in the garden and didn't tell anyone because I thought I didn't deserve to grieve something that small. The book took shape like a quilt, patches of memory stitched together with raw thread. I called it Weightless. How I let go of their labels and found myself again. Colette loved it. "It's not just a memoir," she said. "It's a manual for women who've been told to stay small." I sent her the final draft on a Thursday afternoon. By Monday morning, she called to say it was being fast-tracked. "We want to publish in time for International Women's Day." I looked around the cottage, small, warm, full of late morning light. I wasn't famous, but my words were about to travel farther than I ever had. Emily was the first to read the manuscript. I gave her a printout spiral bound with a note. No edits. Just read. She came back 2 days later, red-eyed, clutching the pages like they were sacred. I didn't know. All of it. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. You were supposed to live your life. It wasn't your fault that mine got paused. She sat beside me on the porch steps and said the thing I'd waited years to hear, not just in words, but in truth. I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter. And I replied, you didn't make me feel that way? I believed it. That was on me. Then I placed my hand over hers. But I don't believe it anymore. The day the book launched, Judith threw a garden party. Nothing fancy, just tea, laughter, and paperbacks tucked into linen napkins like gifts. Dozens of women came. One by one, they asked me to sign their copies. Some added their own stories inside the back covers. This book cracked me open in the best way. I gave this to my mother. We cried on the phone for the first time in 10 years. Thank you for proving it's never too late to choose yourself. I didn't cry that day. But when the garden was empty and the teacups were washed, I sat beneath the arbor and wept. Not from pain, but from arrival. Weeks passed. Interviews. Features. An invitation from a talk show. Even a profile in the New York Times. But the thing that moved me most, a letter mailed to the inn, handwritten in wobbly script. Dear Miriam, I am 87 years old. My family put me in a facility and stopped visiting. One day a nurse played your video. I made her rewind it 3 times. I'm writing to tell you, I'm walking again. Not just with my legs, with my heart. You reminded me I still exist. It was signed only, with light, Bernadette. I framed that letter. It hangs above my writing desk next to the lighthouse figurine Kayla gave me. Emily and I began offering mother-daughter sessions at the retreats, not to air grievances, to unearth empathy. One session a woman stood and said, my daughter doesn't even see me. I'm just background noise to her life. Another replied, maybe she's scared that if she sees you clearly, she'll have to reckon with all the ways she let you down. It was messy. It was beautiful. Sometimes love starts where guilt ends. One evening, I found Kayla sitting in the Hall of Echoes staring at the copper leaves. She pointed to one that read, I matter even when they forget my birthday. Did someone really write that? She asked. I nodded. Every one of those is real. She looked up at me. Will I ever feel like that? My heart clenched. I knelt down beside her. Maybe because the world will always try to make girls forget how powerful they are. But if you remember this wall, these stories, you'll always find your way back. She nodded, serious beyond her years, then whispered, I want to write my own leaf someday. I smiled. You will, darling. You already are. That night, I lit a single candle in the garden, not for prayer, not for ceremony, but as a symbol of all the women still walking through dark rooms, of all the ones still waiting to be called by their name, not burden, but beacon. And as the wind flickered the flame, I said aloud to no one and everyone. I used to ask for light. Now I am the light. And I'm just getting started. The summer waned and the air took on a golden hush. It was that in-between season, still warm in the sun, but with a whisper of cool in the shade. The kind of weather that makes you feel like time itself is catching its breath. At the Blake house, we'd just completed our 20th Lighthouse retreat. Clara, who'd become something of a co-pilot in the program, walked up to me after the final group circle. You realize what you've done, don't you? I gave her a look. Enlighten me. She smiled. You didn't just build a movement. You built a mirror. I raised an eyebrow. A mirror, so women could finally see who they really were. She said, her voice thick with meaning, and realize they were never the problem. I thought about that for days. It echoed in the quiet spaces, in the rustle of linens being folded, the click of teacups returned to trays, the steady thrum of the sea. Because yes, we had created a space for healing. Yes, we had helped women speak again. But the thing that humbled me most, we'd helped them see again, themselves. One evening, I sat on the cottage porch and reread a stack of letters we'd received that week. One was from a woman in Montana. I haven't left my house in 4 years. Your video made me go outside and sit in the sun. It was only 12 minutes, but it felt like I touched God. Another from a teenager. I watched your story with my grandma. She told me something about her past she's never shared. We cried. I think we healed something invisible. I set the letters down, heart thudding with something deeper than pride. This wasn't fame. This was impact. And it came not from performance, but from truth spoken simply and without apology. Colette, my editor, called again. They want to option your book for a limited series, she said, nearly breathless. Netflix, HBO. We're in early talks, but it's real. I sat very still. You're saying they want to make a show out of my life? Well, she said, it wouldn't just be your life. It would be the echo of what your life started. I laughed a bit nervously. Do I get to veto the casting? You get to approve the casting. We both laughed. Then I sobered. If this goes forward, I said, promise me they'll get the quiet moments right. The space between the pain, the grace. They will, she said. If you help write it, another new chapter. At the next Lighthouse retreat, we did something different. We held a letting go ceremony on the beach. Each woman received a small slip of paper and wrote one thing she no longer wished to carry. They placed it inside a biodegradable lantern and walked slowly to the waterline. The sun had just set. The sea shimmered with lavender and fire. As the lanterns drifted out into the dark, we stood hand in hand. I whispered to the group, "You are not what they did to you. You are not what they called you. You are what you kept going in spite of." It was quiet, but the kind of quiet that reorients the soul. Emily attended that ceremony. Afterward, she walked beside me barefoot in the sand lantern glow, fading in the distance. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, she said. And now I know strength is letting yourself be changed. She reached into her pocket and handed me a folded note. Mom, thank you for walking away. Because in doing so, you showed me how to walk toward myself. My throat closed up. I hugged her tightly. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. In August, the inn reached its 5-year anniversary under Serena's ownership. She held a celebration, a blend of open house storytelling night and community potluck. Guests past retreat. Attendees, neighbors, and even staff from other women's shelters came. During the program, she asked me to stand. I've said it before she began, but I'll say it again now, that there are witnesses. Miriam Blake is not just a lighthouse. She is the entire shoreline. There was applause, tears, a standing ovation. But what stayed with me most? The look on Kayla's face. She stared up at me like I was made of galaxies. And maybe, just maybe, I was. After the event, she came up to me, cheeks flushed. "Grandma," she said, "can I tell you something? Always. I want to do what you do someday." "What's that?" "Help people remember their worth." I crouched down and looked her straight in the eyes. "You already do." Later that night, alone in my cottage, I opened the journal again. The archive of the unheard. I flipped to the back and wrote a new entry. This one unsigned. There is no expiration date on worth. No age limit on beginning. No volume requirement for being heard. You can be 17 or 71. What matters is this: that you rise, that you speak, that you never again forget who you are. I closed the journal. The breeze from the window lifted a few pages. Outside, the sea breathed in the dark. Inside, I exhaled everything I no longer carried. Autumn returned like an old friend, familiar, softened, golden at the edges. The leaves fell gently across the inn grounds, and guests once again gathered near the hearth, holding mugs with both hands and speaking in quieter tones, as if the season demanded reverence. Retreat applications now had a 6-month waiting list. The Lighthouse series had expanded into community centers, retirement homes, and even prison programs. One pilot initiative called The Inner Room had been launched in a women's correctional facility in Vermont, based on the emotional storytelling techniques we developed here at the inn. I received a letter from one of the incarcerated women. When I got here, all I felt was shame. But after reading your book, I realized I was punished long before I committed a crime. Thank you for reminding me I still get to tell my story truthfully. That letter now lived in the Hall of Echoes next to Bernadette's. Every woman's voice mattered, especially the ones who thought theirs didn't. One chilly evening, Judith and I sat bundled in blankets outside the cottage. The stars above blinked quietly. "I feel like I'm fading," she said, her hands hidden in wool gloves. "You're not fading," I replied. "You're becoming soft enough to slip into everyone else." She chuckled. "Poetic nonsense. but she squeezed my hand all the same. I want to leave something behind, she said. You already have, I told her. But she shook her head. No, not just an echo, something that guides. I didn't understand at the time, but a few weeks later, Judith slipped away peacefully in her sleep. She left me a sealed envelope and a small wooden box. The note inside read, "My lighthouse was you, but if you ever forget how far you've come, open the box." Inside the box was a compass, not ornate, not antique, just a simple tool of direction, and taped inside the lid a quote she had scribbled in her unmistakable cursive. Home is wherever you are no longer ashamed. I spoke at her memorial. The room was full of people she'd mentored, taught, fed, forgiven. Her reach had been silent but immeasurable. I told them the story of the compass, the quote, the woman who never needed applause to feel full. Then I left a copper leaf for her on the sculpture wall in the garden. She didn't light the way. She handed you the torch. A few weeks later, Kayla asked if we could make something together. A story, she said, but not about the past, about what could be. I smiled. What kind of story? One where a girl builds a house out of all the kind words people forget to say. My heart squeezed. And what happens in the house? People come in and they remember they're important again. I reached out, brushed her hair behind her ear. I think you've just written the blueprint for your own lighthouse. The book sold over 1 million copies. I was on Good Morning America and the host cried on air when I said, "The moment someone called me a burden, I thought it was the end." But it was just the comma before the real sentence began. Still, I kept my mornings sacred. Up before dawn, tea on the windowsill, bird song, blank pages, no headlines. I was still me. And me had taken a long time to rediscover. Emily came by one Saturday with a box of old photos. We spent hours on the cottage floor, cross-legged like children, laughing and crying over pictures of birthday cakes, prom dresses, and a blurry one of my husband with whipped cream on his nose. She paused at one photo, me in my 30s, standing in front of the Blake house during the first week we opened it. You looked so sure, she said. I nodded. I was sure of everyone else. Just not myself. She picked up the compass Judith left me and turned it in her hand. Well, she said, I think you found your north. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my personal journal. I am not the sum of what was withheld from me. I let the ink dry before I closed the cover. The next retreat, we included a new ceremony, the naming. Each woman stood and introduced herself not by name, but by reclaiming a title she'd earned. I am the woman who left at 58. And learned to dance. I am the girl who stopped apologizing for her hunger. I am the storm that stayed calm. When it came to me, I stood and said, I am the one they forgot, until I remembered myself. And the women stood with me not to clap, but to stand with. Together, unforgotten. The seasons would change again. The leaves would fall. New women would arrive, still aching, still searching. But the Blake house would remain. Not because of the structure, but because of the spirit. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped surviving. I started showing up, and in doing so, I became something no one could ever shrink again. The snow returned quietly like it had been waiting all year to remind us how soft the world could be when everything slows down. At the Blake house, we decorated with intention. No overdone garlands or glitzy ornaments. Just handmade wreaths, strings of dried orange slices, candles in every window. It felt more like a place of memory than a holiday destination. This year, we hosted our first silent solstice retreat. It wasn't about reflection through sharing. It was about presence through stillness. 12 women came. No phones. No agendas. No noise. Just 4 days of soft rituals. Tea making handwritten letters, walks in the snow. One woman, Sarah, wrote me a note before leaving. This is the first time I've ever been in a room where I didn't have to prove I belonged. You gave us permission to simply be. That line stayed with me longer than most applause ever had. On the second evening of the retreat, I walked through the halls alone. Snow fell gently outside. The sculpture in the garden shimmered beneath fairy lights. The copper leaves barely moved, but they breathed in their own way. As I passed the Hall of Echoes, I paused at the mirror. We'd recently added a full-length antique piece placed at the end of the hallway, surrounded by quotes. Women would stand in front of it and read aloud the words that rang true to them. That night I stood there too. I read, "You are not too late. You are right on time. The door you thought was locked was just waiting for you to knock." And for the first time in my entire life, I looked at myself in a mirror and thought, I would follow her. The next morning, Serena brought news. "The city wants to recognize the Blake House as a landmark," she said. "Historic for its architecture and revolutionary for what it became." I raised an eyebrow. Revolutionary. You don't think helping hundreds of women find their voices is revolutionary? I thought for a moment. I think it's necessary. She smiled. Exactly. Later that week, Colette called with an update on the book adaptation. "They've greenlit the series," she said. 8 episodes. Streaming worldwide. I sat down slowly at the cottage table. "They're going to tell the whole story." "Yes," she said. "And we want you to narrate parts of it." I chuckled. Are they ready for this voice? They're hungry for it. I looked out the window at the sea. The waves curled like old secrets. "Then let's begin." Recording the narration was strange and sacred. They flew me to a studio in New York walls, padded with foam, a headset on my ears, and a mic close to my mouth. The producer said, "Just speak like you're telling it to your granddaughter." So I did. I told the story of the hallway, the words that broke me, the cottage, the tea, the slow, relentless climb back into my own body. When we finished, the producer took off her headset, eyes glistening. "My mother needs to hear this," she whispered. "So do I." And that, I realized, was the real audience. Not just viewers, witnesses. The premiere came in the spring. I didn't attend the big party in Los Angeles. Instead, we held a screening at the Blake House. Just 30 people, alumni, neighbors, the garden staff. We watched on a projector in the parlor, candles flickering, soft blankets on every lap. When my voice came through the speakers, no one moved. And when the final episode ended with my words echoing across the screen, they tried to write me out. But I kept the pen. The room sat in reverent silence. Then slowly, one by one, they clapped. Not for the show, not even for me, but for themselves. Because the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who had ever waited too long to be believed. Afterward, Emily approached me. She looked radiant, not polished, but present. "I watched every episode in advance," she confessed. "I cried the whole time." "Why?" I asked. She paused. "Because I didn't realize how brave you were until I saw it from the outside." I touched her cheek. Sometimes it takes distance to see the truth. Then she asked, "Was there ever a moment you almost gave up?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." But then I realized I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I was waiting for me. That night, I sat by the fire in the cottage and reread the journal entry from months before. "There is no expiration date on worth." And I added, "There is also no limit to the lives you touch once you reclaim it." I closed the book not with finality, but with peace. I knew now that my life was no longer a question of what if. It was a declaration of what is. Outside, the stars shimmered like quiet applause. Inside, I smiled to myself and whispered aloud, "Let them call me a burden. Let them forget my name. Let them erase me from rooms and photos and plans. I will build my own lighthouse, and I will light the way." The last retreat of the year began quietly, as all the best things do. 12 women arrived, each carrying something, unseen shadows stitched into their voices, silences stretching between their sentences. Some had been mothers, some daughters, some caretakers. A few were none of those things, and yet they all knew the feeling of being discarded. We didn't start with introductions this time. We started with a question written in chalk on the parlor room mirror. Who were you before the world told you who to be? Each woman took her time standing before it. No pressure, no explanation, just a moment with herself. Later, around the fire, we shared our answers. One said, "I used to sing to my plants." Another, "I wanted to be a boxer." And one simply whispered, "I was kind." Her voice cracked on that word. And in that crack, we all found a way back into ourselves. I offered a new closing ritual that weekend, a letter written to the version of themselves who still lived in that moment of betrayal. We folded them gently, tied them with string, and placed them in a wooden box we buried beneath the sycamore tree out front. Not because we wanted to forget, but because we had nothing left to prove. After the retreat, Serena and I walked the coastline trail behind the inn. The wind was sharp, the sea dark blue and frothy. She stopped suddenly and turned to me. You know what this place has become, right? I smiled. A haven. She shook her head. A map. A guide back to self. And you were the compass. I laughed. I was just trying to survive. You did more than survive, she said. You translated pain into possibility. I didn't have an answer. I just let her words land. The Netflix series aired its final episode that week. The final scene showed a dramatized version of my younger self standing in a hallway overhearing the words that started it all. She's just a burden. But in the series, something changed. Instead of breaking, the character stood a little straighter. She looked down the hallway and walked away. The camera panned to her hand gripping a key. The door she opened led not to a basement, but to light, a garden, a path, a lighthouse in the distance. Then came the final voice over my voice. You can call me forgotten. You can call me a burden. But never again will I answer to anything less than whole. The impact was immediate. Messages flooded in from across the world. You told my story. I left today. After 29 years, I left. My daughter and I are speaking again for the first time in a decade. I started writing. I started walking. I started believing. The day after the finale, I sat on the edge of the cliff behind the inn. Emily joined me. Kayla, too. We didn't say much. We just watched the sea. Finally, Kayla asked Grandma, "Are you happy?" I turned to her, thought for a moment, then said, "I'm free." That's better than happy. She nodded as if she understood more than her age should allow, then added, "I want to be like you." And I replied, "Then you'll be someone unforgettable." That night, I wrote the final entry in my personal journal. There was once a woman who was called a burden. She believed it for a while. Then one day she left. She didn't run. She didn't rage. She simply gathered her quiet power and walked out the back door and built something that could never be burned down. Her name was Miriam Blake, and she lit the way. If you're still listening, I hope you heard more than just my voice. I hope you heard your own, because the truth is, I didn't tell this story for applause or recognition or even forgiveness. I told it because there's a woman out there. Maybe she's you, sitting alone in a room. She didn't choose holding silence, like it's the only thing that won't be taken from her. To her I say this: you are not a burden. You are not an afterthought or a mistake, or a guest in your own life. You are the author. You can leave. You can return. You can build a house from the ashes and call it sanctuary. You can whisper and still be heard. You can reclaim every inch of space you once apologized for occupying. And one day someone will look at you and say, "She was the light I didn't know I was walking toward." That's not legend. That's not luck. That's you coming home to yourself. So if you're ready, walk out the back door, turn the doorknob, step into your next chapter. And if no one else shows up to clap, know this: I'm already standing, applauding you, from the lighthouse. You made it. And now, you light the way.